Hello everyone and welcome to week 10 of our English Introduction to Literature class. I hope everyone's doing well. Congratulations on finishing the Novel Winter's Bone and the Winter's Bone exam, which was due on Sunday. This week we're moving into poetry. We only have 2 weeks left of the class. We have a little bit of poetry, and then next week will be dedicated towards our final work and our final reflection. I want to say a little bit about that final week first, and I'll go back and talk about poetry and what you're going to be doing this week. And the final reflection and the extra credit assignments aren't due until next week, but I've posted them just so you can start thinking about them. You can certainly submit anything you want right now, but again, they're not due until next week. This week we'll be focusing in on poetry, and the assignments for this week are to read a number of poems, and then to do a discussion assignment. There is no quiz this week. The discussion assignment will serve as the quiz assignment as well. And it's meant to review the characters, the stories, the plots, the settings of things that we've read from the semester. Now I know that some of you out there absolutely adore poetry, I'm sure. Some of you probably don't, and some of you might have not had a lot of experience with it. I like to save poetry for the end of this class, because the reading, A, is going to be a little bit less, and B, I think it's a fun thing to kind of let your mind run a bit wild with poetry. Poetry is defined as a rhythmical composition of words expressing an attitude designed to surprise and delight and arouse an emotional response. Now let's break this down really quickly. First of all, poetry is a rhythmical composition. That rhythm sometimes comes in the form of syllables or beats. Sometimes it comes in the form of rhyming schemes. Sometimes it just comes in the form of a word that, as Billy Collins, the poet we're going to read this week, would say, helps the poem skip down the street a little bit smoother. Words have sounds. Those sounds have connotations. Those sounds have meanings, and poets think about those words. Since a poem can sometimes be as short as 1 or 2 lines, or certainly as long as a couple hundred pages. Most poems fall more into the category of 1 or 2 pages at the most. And those words that are on the page carry more weight because there's fewer of them. And so when I read a poem, I pay very particular attention to the word choice. And that word choice can be have meaning. A word can be chosen for a specific meaning, or that word choice can be more structural and point towards something like rhythm. Okay, so we got poetry being a rhythmical composition of words expressing an attitude. That might be the theme or the mood or the feeling that the poem has. It's designed to surprise and delight and to arouse an emotional response. And I want you to think about that in terms of the stories we've read, the play that we've read, and the novel that we've read. Have any of those characters, any of those settings, any of those plots aroused an emotional response? I'll go back to the first story that we read this semester, The Interlopers by Saki, where we have 2 characters stuck under a tree waiting for their men to come down the hill to help them. They put down their fight, they've forgiven each other, and who shows up but some wolves? And certainly that always arouses an emotional response in me. I'm frightened, I'm scared, I'm excited. Poems have the same kind of goal, and maybe a lot of art does as well. Film, music, sculpture, painting, photography, and the written language arts as well. I think at their core, in some way, shape, or form, they want to affect the reader and arouse an emotional response. This is a textbook definition. Robert Frost, the famous poet from Vermont, who was maybe the most famous poet of the 20th century, certainly one of the more famous American poets, he was asked, "What is poetry, Mr. Frost?" And he said poetry is the kind of things that poets write. That's funny. This for me is kind of an interesting quote because it makes me think, what's a poet? What does a poet do? If poetry is what poets write, then what does a poet do? Well, a poet explores moments and ideas. So in the poems that we're going to be reading this week, look for what that moment is. Look for what that idea is. What is the poet trying to get us closer to? The poets find language and images to find and make an experience more meaningful. I love language. I love specific language choices. And like I said earlier on in this recording, the words in a poem are given a greater weight because there are fewer of them. And so I love to just think about the language and images that a poet uses. A poet turns a world to glass. And what does that mean? That means to me that if it's a great poem, it's a poem that arouses an emotional response in me, I'm brought up to the window of it. I'm looking through it. I'm seeing into it. I'm watching what the poet is doing and what the poet is saying. And so a great poem for me does that. It kind of brings me up to the window of that poem to let me look in. And of course, like I just said, a poet gets us one step closer to a thing. Now, there are a few poetic devices or figurative language items that I want you to know and look for in the poems today, or the poems for this week. And these are language devices, poetic devices, almost tools that a poet has to express that idea, to express that feeling, to express that emotion. We got metaphors and similes. Now, they are very similar. A metaphor is a comparison of two unlike things. My heart is the ocean. It's a horrible metaphor, but that's why I'm not a poet. But I'm comparing my heart to the ocean. That's a metaphor. A simile, same thing, to a comparison of two unlike things, but using the word like or as. So my heart is like the ocean. Personification is giving human qualities to non-human things. The ocean was angry today. Oceans can't be angry. That's an emotion. That's a human emotion, an animal emotion. Certainly not one that an ocean would have. So look for personification. And then alliteration are repeated consonant sounds. Silly Susie sat by the seashore. That's kind of a ridiculous alliteration. Sometimes those repeated consonant sounds have an ability to create a feeling, or even, going back to Billy Collins, let the poem skip down the road a little bit smoother. Let's take a look at one quick poem here. One of my favorites. Harlem by Langston Hughes. He was a great poet of the early 20th century. Lived in Harlem. He is African American and wrote about his community and about things he saw in his community. And this is one of the more famous poems that he came up with. It's called Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Poem starts with a pretty interesting question. What happens to a dream deferred? And deferred means to put off for a while, to halt something for later attainment. Sometimes you get back to those things, sometimes you don't. So the poet asks here, what happens to those dreams that we defer? What happens to those dreams that we have, that we put off for a time far down the road? Do those dreams dry up like a raisin in the sun? Do they fester like a sore and run? Do they stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? What we can see the poet doing here is using similes, comparing a dream deferred to a dried up raisin in the sun, or a festering sore, or rotten meat, or a syrupy sweet. Finally, the poet takes that dream deferred, that dream you've put off for a while, and compares it to a heavy load. Finally, an explosion. A lot of these images seem to have a time element to them. The longer a grape sits in the windowsill, the less grape-like it becomes and turns into a raisin. Rotten meat, the longer it sits out, the more rotten it becomes. And some of these images are, I would say, negative and violent. A heavy load, sagging, weighing you down, an explosion. Sometimes people can read that explosion in different ways. Maybe a dream deferred actually comes back later in life to have a creative, positive force in your life. But I think what the poet here is looking at is just that impulse. What happens to us when we have a dream, something we really want to do, and it doesn't come true. It's a good poem. I love the imagery in it. It's a wonderful question to ask. It's a wonderful question to think about, and the poet uses really potent similes throughout the poem. Alright, for this week, you're going to be reading a number of other poems, in particular some by Billy Collins, who is considered America's most famous poet. He was poet laureate twice, and there's a video of him reading a poem, a few of his poems if you'd like to see. There is a discussion assignment which is meant to help you review the characters, plots, and settings from this semester, and you can look at the stuff that's due next week as well. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out, and take care. We're almost at the end of the semester. Continue your wonderful work.